Aldana, who is a faculty member at the Ivey School, and she's a specialist in food safety regulatory challenges affecting the agri-food sector in cross-border trade. She's worked all over the place, done all sorts of things. She worked at one of my favorite companies, just because it's fun to say, Grupo Bimbo, which is also unique in the fact that it is a Mexican company which is invested heavily in Canada. Usually we see the investment going in the other direction, so Grupo Bimbo was a real pathfinder there. So Yadira and her colleagues have been working assiduously on this presentation and this program, so let's see what she has to say and tell her what we think. Want my mic?
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. I'm shorter, so I'm gonna be standing somewhere here. I'm really happy to be here today to present some of the work that we are doing at the Ivey Business School in relation to regulatory cooperation. So the whole idea of my presentation is to give you some food for thought about this concept of the Food Safety Risk Assessment Organization and how can we use this as a stepping stone for achieving regulatory alignment between Canada and the US. So I want to start with a really basic concept that I'm pretty sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, and this is the risk analysis. We know that every time that we need to assess public health or risk, or food safety or public health risk, or whenever we want to evaluate a new procedure, a new technology, or we want to make modifications to any standard, we have to use the risk analysis framework, which is really structured, but it gives us some flexibility as well. We also know that whenever we want to do any modification to a new standard, we have, or make an informed decision, we have to start with a basis. So in this case, it's the risk assessment. And here's where I'm gonna focus most of my presentation. We know in an ideal world, all data will be collected through the whole food safety system. It will be accessible to us, and we'll be able to share that information between the different sectors, right? But the truth is that data is collected through so many different agencies, networks, and research groups that most of the time they work in isolation. So it's really hard for risk managers and actually risk assessors to have access to all this information in a timely manner whenever they have to make a risk-based decision. So I wanted to exemplify this data reality. So I chose as an example the foodborne illness surveillance data collection. So I put here some of the initiatives that are used in the US for collecting data for foodborne illness. And they are not all of them, there are just some of them. But I'm not gonna go in detail on them. What I want you to look at is how many different agencies are involved in each initiative. And we're going from federal agencies all the way to local and state agencies. And if we look at the Canadian side, we also have many initiatives that have been working towards collecting data for foodborne illness. And we can see it happen something similar. We have different agencies and centers within those agencies that are involved in data collection. So it doesn't really matter which side of the border we are, right? All these initiatives are working towards the same objective, collecting information for foodborne illness. And the fact that there are so many agencies and so many initiatives working towards this objective is what increases the complexity for collecting data and sharing this data whenever we need it for risk assessment. And the government is not the only one that is involved in data collective. The industry also plays a key role in that. Industry collects a lot of data through their quality assurance programs, and also during inspections that collect a lot of data that might be really relevant whenever we do scientific assessments. However, we also know that for the industry, it's harder to share this data due to confidentiality issues or liability reasons. So what I wanted to show you here are some examples of collaboration that is already happening between the government, the academia, and also the industry. And this example is VoluntaryNet. I don't know if you have heard about it, but the main objective is to actually engage the industry more in enhancing foodborne illness surveillance and outbreak response activities. It actually provides a platform where the industry can share their testing results, and it can actually share it with more industries and also with the government, in this case, the CDC. And also another important thing is that it provides a platform for the industry to get access, indirect access, to all this data that is collected. And all this data is gonna go up to PulseNet Canada. And PulseNet Canada started, PulseNet started in the 90s, more or less, in the US, and then Canada tried to harmonize and created PulseNet Canada. And currently, PulseNet has become an international molecular subtyping network. And they are actually supporting the whole genome sequence project. And this is a new initiative for DNA fingerprinting of pathogens. And the idea is that it will be more accurate and we will have a better, earlier response to outbreaks. So we can see that it is possible to have that collaboration between the industry, the government, and the academia. And as we've seen with PulseNet, why can we use these initiatives that are already there for foodborne and try to use them to strengthen collaboration between, cross-border collaboration between both countries? So why is it relevant to have data sharing? Well, Canada and the US already have a really well-integrated food supply chain, right? And however, this integration we're still not seeing in the approach to food safety, in the scientific approach to food safety. And here are some examples of this disjointed science. So for example, the GRAS approval process, which is used in the US but not in Canada. Or methodologies for pathogen testing. Canada has a specific compendium of analytical methods that for audit purposes, companies have to use the methods that are in there. New technologies and product approvals. I was reading about this case of a margarine that was approved in the US, and it took almost 10 years to be approved in Canada. So I'm gonna leave here some room for Rory and Mike to explain us more their regulatory approach from their business perspective. And what I wanna show you is some examples of how can we actually integrate risk assessment. So the European Food Safety Authority, it started more or less 10 years ago and has become a really integral part of the food safety system in Europe. And I'm gonna explain briefly how it works. It works through a request. So any of the member states or even the Commission can request to do a scientific assessment of a certain issue. EFSA will assign that request to one of the 10 different experts, panels of experts that they have. This panel is gonna assign a working group of experts, and here is where the actual science and integration is gonna happen. They are gonna request information and literature from different sources, and if necessary, they can actually ask external scientists to work with them. Once they have this, all this integration of data, they will draft a proposal. And that proposal will have to be approved by the panel. And once it's approved, EFSA is gonna distribute it to all the member states or the European Commission and other interested parties. And also something important is that that advice is gonna be publicly available. And using that information, policymakers will be able to make a decision about a certain topic. The other example that I wanna show, is the Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. This one works a little bit different than EFSA because they are responsible for standard setting. And they are also responsible of developing and maintaining the food standards code. So they don't only do science, but they use this science to decide if a modification in the code is needed. And they also communicate that information to the public. So these are two different models that have been successful in other parts of the world and that we can use as an example for trying to think about this food safety risk assessment organization. Canada and the US have already a history of collaborating and working together. And I want to just explain some of these examples. We started with the International Joint Commission that was created to protect the shared waters of the Great Lakes. In 2007, through the technical working groups of NAFTA, the first joint approval of a harmonized label for a pesticide was done. In 2011, the RCC was created, and during the first phase, the Joint Action Plan, we have already some successes, like the Common Electronic Submission Gateway and the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. The RCC entered a second phase with a joint forward plan, and we already have seen something done with the approval of a veterinary drug. And the most recent one is the Food Safety Systems Recognition Agreement that was signed last year. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that one. It was signed by the FDA, CFIA, and Health Canada. And some important aspects is that it promotes a formal mechanism for scientific exchange and collaboration. And it also wants to do collaboration on risk-informed decision-making. The only thing that the recognition agreement doesn't include are meat, poultry, and processed eggs, which we know they are really important in trade between Canada and the US. So what do we want to promote with a risk assessment organization? Well, we want to promote the exchange of scientific information and collaboration between both countries. We want to promote also innovation between both countries by keeping pace with science and with the needs also of industry and society. We want to have a well-established network of experts for cooperation and exchange of knowledge, and we also want to create risk assessments that are consistent and that can be used by both countries. At the end, I think everything is about achieving regulatory harmonization. We want to reduce unwarranted and contradictory regulatory requirements, and we want to also reduce all the administrative burden and cost for the industry and government. And we have to start by the basis, which is the science. So I think it's all for my presentation.
Thank you. All right, we're going to put Yadira on the hot seat, and we're going to invite up Rory McAlpine, Senior Vice President, Government and Industry Relations with Maple Leaf Food, and apparently an avid lipstick wearer from what we hear from Panel 1. Or maybe it's the rugged chapstick. Yes. And Michael Roebuck, Vice President, Corporate Food Safety, Quality and Regulatory for Cargill, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a great city, practically Canada.
Especially certain times of the year.
Is it snowing there yet?
Not yet.
All right. All right, well, Yadira did a good job of laying out the framework of where we've been and where we potentially could go. You folks are in the industry. You wrote a brilliant paper that was jointly produced by Don's organization and ours. So could I ask you both to give us a few minutes just reflecting on where we are with food safety risk assessment, where you think we could be, and any reactions you have to Yadira's presentation? Mike, you're nodding, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this area is something that has been very important from my perspective. I've been in the food business for over 40 years now, and there have been a lot of changes that have gone on in the industry. And the one thing that continues to frustrate me, especially now that I'm at Cargill, been there for 14 years, we have about 1,500 plants in 70 different countries. So we have very wide exposure to the regulatory inconsistencies that we see around the world. And having a global company that produces in almost every aspect of the food system, it's really, really important that we have a systems approach and that we're focused on those risks that impact public health. We haven't talked a lot about public health, but that's really why we're all here. We're here to produce safe food for consumers everywhere. So regardless of where they are, they deserve safe food. And so that's our responsibility. So we adopted a systems approach, which is very, very rooted in the consistency of Codex principles, an ISO 22000 framework that really drives us forward regardless of where we are in the world. And we all have to start with assessing risk, identifying hazards and assessing risks, and putting our systems in place to mitigate those risks so that we're producing safe food. So we try to do that as consistently as we can. But often, the frustration we see is that we've got to add additional components to our programs because of regulatory differences around the world, not all of which are based in science. So for me, coming back to what is the real importance here, it's to get everyone, I mean the private sector and the public sector, started from the same point by having a joint risk assessment, or at least a risk assessment authority that can speak for everyone in the marketplace and really get folks focused on those elements of a system that need to be there in order to produce safe food. If we don't agree on what the risks are, and we don't agree on what are the importance of those risks, we're often pointed in directions that don't improve the safety of the food. And really, we have to keep that outcome in mind. We're here to produce safe food. And in order to do that, we've got to be on the same page as it's related to the risks that we're trying to mitigate in our systems.
Well, thanks, Mike. You've said it very well, and I would just really reiterate the idea that science is the foundation. Yadira, you said this, and that surely science is a universal language, and as Bob said, we in North America attend the same universities, we read the same research publications. Our language of food safety risk assessment is essentially identical. HACCP as a concept, which actually came out of the U.S. space program, is the language that we use and is the foundation for risk management, both from a regulatory and industry perspective, rooted in a common sense of how you need to control the hazards that occur. So to me, it should not necessarily, it does not need to be controversial in that sense. Like we've said, this isn't about saying you manage the risk jointly necessarily, although I would point out, the more we can move to the space of joint technology approvals, we've cited examples in veterinary drugs or joint pesticide label approvals. We've proven we can do it in these areas, so why not in food safety, including processing aids, additives, test methods that Yadira mentioned, so that I know my colleague from 3M is here. So when 3M develops a food safety technology, they aren't necessarily seeking approval twice over, that it will be one risk assessment to inform it. And maybe the last point here is to also point out that beyond agri-food, I don't know a lot about the aircraft safety issue, but I gather airline safety is a universally regulated issue. Like if you're using a part for an airline construction or replacement, the standards that apply to those parts are universal. And if there's an air crash somewhere in the world, the learnings, the investigation, the risk assessment that is associated with that event is universally shared, and the outcomes, any actions or learnings from that are shared and adopted by all regulatory authorities. I've used the example, and I don't want to be flippant, but we have in North America something called NORAD. We have a joint air security system that manages the risk of intercontinental ballistic missiles coming to North America. So why on earth can't we do that when it comes to pathogens on, leafy greens from China or whatever it is? It's just, I think, a lack of perhaps imagination, or perhaps just taking for granted that we don't need to do it. Well, as we've said, supply chains are globalizing, risks are globalizing, so we do more than ever need to do it together.
Great. I'm not a food specialist at all, so I'm going to ask the dumb questions. It seems like there's a consensus for a food safety risk assessment organization. Yadira, you lay out a good case, and these two gentlemen have supported it. What's it going to take? We say, okay, let's start a food safety risk assessment organization. What do you do week one on the job? How do you go from here to there? I know in your report you talk about, you liken this to establishment of the St. Lawrence Seaway. That's a pretty big undertaking. How do you get this off the ground? Yadira.
Well, I think, as I put as an example, the voluntary net, like if we start actually with research, I'm an academic, right? So start with collaboration between universities, for example, putting together programs for that can look at issues that are for interest in both sides of the border and start looking at them in that way. So I will go for that type of collaboration, starting from that.
What's it going to take?
It's going to take governments to make a decision to make this happen. I mean, they're the ones that assess risk today. FDA assesses risk, USDA assesses risk, CFIA assesses risk. We got a lot of people that do risk assessment, and they don't always do it the same way. And often it's the risk managers that are doing the risk assessment. And so there isn't that independence, and there isn't always that input of data that needs to come from sectors other than the public sector. So that's a challenge. I mean, and Bob mentioned GFSI in his opening remarks, and for full disclosure, I'm the current chairman of the board of directors of the Global Food Safety Initiative, so I appreciated him bringing GFSI up. GFSI is a perfect example of what the private sector has done to really try to overcome some of the inconsistencies that we see in government regulation, because we had to assure the integrity of our supply chains, wherever they originated, wherever the food was processed, and wherever it was distributed and consumed, our responsibility. So we went out and built that. And now we're in the process of trying to pull governments into that program to get them to understand what we've done and to drive the importance of alignment and harmonization. And I'll have to say we're making some progress. And this particular initiative, I think, feeds right into that, because it's something that needs to happen, but we've got to get governments to the table.
I guess the comment I would make is, and Yadira, you start in the right place. Collaboration is good, but I ask the question, is it good enough? I don't think it is good enough, because we aren't achieving that food safety outcome to the level that we could, or the technology approvals in a way that gets things to market faster at less cost. So we can do better. To the actual question of how do you get there? Well, we've talked about NAFTA. Like, I do see this as a moment of time where, if you will, the trade officials and the trade negotiators have climbed to the top of the heap. They're the ones now that have to make calls and judgments about issues that otherwise perhaps are going to be managed strictly at a regulatory level. As I've said, cooperation at the pace of convenience. If we're going to move beyond convenience to, something more ambitious, we've got a moment with NAFTA where trade objectives hopefully can be the forefront. So that may mean then in NAFTA we need a regulatory cooperation chapter. We need clearly an identification of the kinds of things we will agree in a legally binding way to do better. How you then execute, probably it means perhaps an exchange of side letters where, yes, you've got to negotiate this. There's lots of details to work through. It's not going to happen overnight. And maybe it starts modestly where you identify a joint program of work that's going to agree on a certain number of food safety hazards. Bear in mind, to me, this is about looking forward. It's not trying to say that you're going to undo all the assessments we've done in the past to determine that our salmonella standard for poultry is X and yours is Y. Hard to undo that. But think about, for example, antibiotic resistance in our food and animal and human medicine. This is a hugely emerging, important area of risk for society, for the world. So why wouldn't we get on top of that together to define where the risks are, do that work together? And similarly, any new emerging pathogen or vector or whatever is threatening, whether it's our forests or our food, we do that going forward together. So then we're in the place of perhaps coming to and then ultimately, can you actually institutionalize it like the Joint Commission? That will take some time, but we've done it before.
I'm going to be asking you folks, because we want some feedback, we want some ideas to take forward. I'm going to be asking you folks, does this idea make sense? If not, why not? And if so, where should we be going next? But before we get to that, while you're thinking about your responses, I just want to sort of get my arms around this issue. When we're talking about the RCC, we're talking about federal level regulations only. in this proposal, are we also talking about state and provincial, potentially municipal, and how do you deal with that big nest of vipers?
Can I jump in on that?
Please do.
Well, for sure. We're two federal countries, two federated states. Very challenging. But here's the thing about it. And, you know, yeah, in some ways, it's a bit ironic that, you know, we would talk about, you know, bilateral harmonization in this space when we don't have it. At least we sure don't in Canada. Mike can talk about the situation in the U.S. Of course, the U.S. has got more than one, you know, regulator between USDA and FDA. But so absolutely, we have to do better to address these regulatory inconsistencies internally. We have now in Canada, finally, a free trade agreement, albeit full of exceptions. We need to do better, but I do believe there's an opportunity, as I've seen in the past, where it's your international obligations or progress that can actually drive your domestic progress in this kind of space. Because, and we've got that now. We've got examples where, thanks to NAFTA and other free trade agreements, we've got a more seamless kind of regulatory or trade situation with some third countries than we do internally in Canada. And I think there is some of that in the US as well. So I say bring it on, and let's get them all let's get everybody at the table to figure this out.
Mike, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rory. I mean, it is a fragmented landscape, although I would say in our meat and poultry businesses, you know, we're a little more aligned with USDA FSIS. In our food businesses, it's all over the map, depending on what state you are in terms of what locale you are. FDA is trying to pull that together with FSMA and trying to, you know, herd the cats in terms of getting alignment with the 50 states, that there will be consistency in the way that the rules and regulations will be deployed. I mean, that all remains to be seen because the states are highly independent in certain instances. So we have a long way to go as well. And for me, it is really about let's get this risk assessment authority so that it can inform all the regulators, you know, all the public risk managers out there, regardless of where they sit. But at the same time, it also helps inform the private sector. So as we're putting food safety management systems in place, we're able to address those areas of greatest risk. So to me, it's a win-win. You get consistency, you get people focused on the same outcome, and that's producing safe food to improve public health.
And if you're drawing on the same data, you know, that idea of your surveillance data that's out there, like Yadira listed all those examples, and, you know, the state or provincial officials are drawing on that too. The one example I'll give you that folks in Canada are very familiar with, it's neonicotinoids in Ontario, right, where this pesticide product, which has been linked to bee health problems. So Ontario took a unique position based on their, you know, risk assessment. I am no expert in that area at all. But they chose to take a path that has resulted in a regulatory decision on the use of these pesticides in grain crops that is, you know, questionable perhaps. But the point is, if we had this kind of institution, I would like to think that Ontario would think first, let's refer it to the real experts, right? This national or this North American body, and that might start to overcome some of those provincial measures.
And I think,
Looking at Deb.
and I think this risk assessment authority then can pull in not just the risk managers within the regulatory agencies, but also public health experts and other experts in the field. So it becomes more of an open, transparent process. So everybody can feel comfortable with the results. As you say, the data set coming in and how that analysis takes place and who's involved in the process, I think become important elements to really help boost public confidence in the system.
And do you adopt an approach like the RCC did, which is those sectors which have identifiable problems or needs come to you and say, we want to start here, or do you start with a universal global approach to food?
Well, I mean, to me, if I take that model of looking forward, I think it is the surveillance, it's the illness reporting, you know, it's those things that inform where you focus your energies on any given day. I mean, you also have to manage for the risk assessment work that's associated with illness outbreaks. You have to, you know, deploy risk assessment to manage and contain and recall when necessary. But in terms of how you define the work program, I think that's where the experts, where government, and maybe where industry together, you know, you define what those emerging issues are. I use the example of antibiotic use as just one. in animal health. We, you know, as North America, we've been lucky to avoid foot and mouth disease for many decades. But, you know, I think if you put us together, we'd all agree, maybe it's time to update the risk assessments and the planning around that kind of phenomenon. That's, now I'm going beyond food safety, but these are the kind of things we should be doing.
And you could very well take a step back and just look at where are the inconsistencies? Where are there differences? And ask the question, why?
Yeah.
Why are there differences? And maybe that's a place to start.
Yadira, any thoughts here?
No, I agree with them. I think the industry is a good point to start with that, like to see what are they facing, and you can use that as a priority for a working plan.
Great. Once in my misspent early career, I was doing a tour for the Russian Consumer Safety Association shortly after the fall of the wall, and I was taking the head director, Sergey, on a tour of Canada, and I was at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in Health Canada, and he saw all of the things that were very important, and his delegation. And so we were talking at the end of the program, and Russia was having a lot of problems. It had lead in the tea, it had exploding cigarette lighters, and Sergey comes to me and he said, "Laura, we have a complete and wonderful program for carpet underpadding." I said, "Excellent, so you've got a global standard for carpet underpadding." I said, "But what about the exploding cigarette lighters and the lead in the tea?" He said, "Don't worry, Laura, I am director for life." And long may he wave. Okay, responses from you. What do you think of this idea? Does it fly? If so, where do you start? If not, why not? And I'm gonna pick on my friend Kelly Johnson from Campbell Soup over here.
I knew you would too, Laura.
Yeah, I knew you would.
First of all, I've had the pleasure of knowing these two gentlemen for many years, and I think I've worked with Mike for half of your career over the years, and whatever Mike says, I usually support because he's usually right. I read the study that they did, and I was very impressed by it, and I have been, and I've seen my friend Bob Carberry as well. He and I have been at the beginning as RCC going back to 2005, so this is very consistent and very much aligned with what he advocated during his presentation. I think you asked the right question, though, is, well, how do we make this happen? We've been banning about ideas for a long time on how to improve in this space, and we really haven't gotten a lot of progress. And I just, as somebody who is a lobbyist by profession, I would suggest a couple of avenues. I do think this is going to require an act of Congress, because I don't want to see a layering in of yet another agency on top of what already exists that will beg for competition and resistance. So I do think it's going to require that, which is never easy, obviously, but I think there's a couple of avenues to get there. You need a good champion. And we have, first, and many people don't know this, we actually have a U.S.-Canada interparliamentary union. It's been around for a long time. And you've got a very robust set of both Canadian parliamentarians and members of Congress, both parties, both branches, Senate and House and Parliament. And that is a great place for people who have clearly some investment in this relationship to attract the champion to make this happen. We have vehicles in the U.S. coming up. We have maybe a farm bill. This may not be the best place for it, but that ought to be one avenue we should explore. In addition, we have a terrific Northern Border Caucus in the U.S. Congress, mostly on the House side. Bipartisan, great place to go, because if for anybody that has a vested interest in this are those who have districts or ridings that sit on the border where there's already a tremendous amount of cross-border trade. So there's great ways to make this happen, and I'll be the first person to volunteer to help make this go. And I know, Mike, your government affairs operation, your company's operation is one of the best in the country, so I'm happy to work with your colleagues, Roy, you work with you and across the border, and I'm happy to see this advance. It needs to happen.
Thank you. You don't hand back that microphone yet. I have a question. Everybody's in favor of this. Who's opposed to it? What are the challenges? Is it just complexity and organization and consensus building?
In the modern parlance, the deep state. There are people who just really are invested in the current systems, not just in government, but even some, sadly, in the private sector, lawyers with great practices who just don't want to mess with what they have. That sounds cynical, but it's true. And I've seen it in other categories as well. So there will be some resistance. Opposition may be a strong word. If there's enough momentum and enough support from the right circles, I think we can overcome that.
Right, yeah. Nobody posed it. It just wasn't that interesting. Right. Gentleman right behind Kelly. Thanks, Kelly.
Hi, I have a bit of a naive question.
But you got to introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Brandon Scheifele. I'm a professor at the Ivey Business School. There's an asymmetry between Canada and the United States. One of these countries is much larger and much better resourced than the other. Why doesn't Canada just follow? Why do we need cooperation? Why doesn't Canada just adopt the US standard?
Bob Carberry has got little wheels turning.
I would hasten to say that would be a mistake. I mean, I'm serious. It would be a mistake. You know, I think the U.S. would be better off maybe adopting the Canadian standard. You know, I believe, and again, we operate in 70 countries around the world, and the regulatory complexity that we're faced with in this country is probably ranking right up there with any other country in the world because of the sheer number of agencies that one needs to deal with in the production of our agricultural businesses and food production. It's not a simple path forward. It's not streamlined. It's not aligned. You jump from one to another, and it's very complex. So that would be my answer to your question.
Laura, I will jump in.
Yeah.
There's a question.
Bob has grabbed a microphone.
This is a question that came up a lot.
Yeah.
And I've had a fairly unique vantage point looking at all the regulatory agencies that you could imagine in both countries. There is no constant between the two countries about who's better. In some spaces, Canada's better. In some spaces, the U.S. is better. Within food, some parts of food we're better. In other parts of food, someone else is better. That's why the way to do this is when you need to update a standard, do it together. It's got to be about modernizing the system together, but at no point does it work to say we're just going to adopt. It doesn't make sense, and that's more complex, I think, in terms of, and the other part of this is you need to tell somebody else they were wrong. Ours is better because you were wrong, and that's never going to be palatable. So we always kept it on the path. When it's time to renew something, when there's something new that comes on, work together on it. You'll end up in the same place.
Great point. I was on the team that actually was developing, that got the RCC launch. I'm a Canadian, but I was on the US side. And what we heard from the Canadians was that they had been de facto adopting US standards for years and years and years because it made no sense to have separate lines and separate production facilities and separate. It was only when the regulators forced difference upon them that they had difference. So for the most part, the Canadians would wait and see what the US did, wait and see that that regulation change stuck, and then they would adopt it. The problem is if you get fixity, if you get alignment at a moment in time, it's only for a moment, and then that regulation could change, or the phase-in times could change. So if you don't have people who are talking to each other continuously and committed to keeping those regulations aligned and in tune with each other, it's a very frustrating exercise.
I think you're referring to what I refer to as random spasms of momentary alignment. Is that what we see?
Better, yes. I'm not sure I can say that from the front of the room, though. Rory.
Well, it's a very important and a very valid question, and it's that kind of political reality that we have to be very conscious of as we, promote this kind of thinking. At the end of the day, yes, Canada is much smaller, less resourced. But the other angle on that is that we have a smaller market. Most of the major technology innovations in this space tend to come from the US, Europe, other jurisdictions. And because our market is smaller, there tends to be a natural commercial delay in, pursuing regulatory approvals. Certainly from where I sit as a Canadian, I would like our regulators to default as much as possible to the risk assessments that would be done by the US. And that may mean the standard itself is the same, but again, let's not jump to standards. So I think that, that's a rational way to go. I'll give you an example. Right now, both countries are implementing new nutrition facts tables. In this case, FDA, USDA, and Health Canada. They've both come to different conclusions about how do you address added sugars on nutrition labeling. Now, that to me is the kind of thing which should be a fairly technical, science-based decision. Is there a lot of politics in that? Maybe there is. I guess there's politics in sugar for sure. But the point is, as an emerging issue arises, something, you went through in beef, S-Tex, the way the U.S. has approached the particular pathogens of beef. Like, to the extent that emerged first in the U.S., and that a whole bunch of science is done in the US, then yeah, why would, if Health Canada or CFI is going to regulate, why wouldn't we just default? So I definitely think in the most cases that would be the normal thing, but I just hesitate to say we're just going to cede sovereignty and that's it. No, that's not going to work. And in the EFSA example, the member states aren't ceding authority to EFSA. They're relying on EFSA science to inform whether it's a EU directive or standard or a member state directive or standard, but the process results in greater harmonization.
Thank you. And this lady here has the last question. Madame.
My name is Suzanne Sabo, and I just wanted to echo the statement of the fine gentleman from Campbell Foods. I did have the opportunity to read the paper that Rory and Mike authored, and of course, how do we get there? And when I was reading it and hearing the conversation today, it struck me that we can take, I hesitate to say this, but we can take a page of what the government has taken to lobby the current administration to ensure that NAFTA would have favorable outcomes from Canada. And we too have committees and caucuses and MPs that could champion the cause, federal, provincial networks of deputy ministers, ADMs, and that working on it collectively with our colleagues in the States would be a way of getting the job done and getting some momentum to get something started. Because as Bill indicated, I've also worked on the RCC and have witnessed the difficulties that we have to go through and the stumbling blocks and the hurdles when dealing with our regulators. And they're looking at issues, they're very process-oriented, and we have to take it a notch up here and look at strategic issues and how we implement this regulatory strategy on both sides of the border. Thank you.
Thank you. And this really is a win for North America, North American competitiveness. I mean, we are very fixated, with some good reason, on the sort of greatest hits and problems in the NAFTA negotiations, but this is a really clear example of cross-border cooperation that would lower costs, increase consumer health and safety, potentially increase jobs, and reduce regulatory red tape. Those seem like very strong wins, no matter what political stripe you're coming from. So while we are fixated on the problems, this is a solution waiting to happen. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. You'll have a chance to talk to them a bit more at a reception at the end of this program. We're going to have another 5-minute stretch and a bio break while we reset our front panel. And then my friend Dawn will take over with our trade group.